Hey everybody, welcome back. Tonight's episode number 8. We're talking about structures and scene composition. We've only got 2 more episodes left, and then we're going to be doing sort of an after the build with Big Bill on his show right after we're done with the series here. Talks for season 2 are actually moving along pretty good. Got some ideas, got some major changes coming up. But anyway, let's get into it. As always, don't forget to subscribe to MRL and click the bell for notifications. We didn't have any questions from the previous shows so far, which is a little disappointing, but what are you going to do? So let's go ahead and get right down into Andy and what Andy's talking about and working on tonight.
All right. So 1 second, I'm going to turn my camera around and we're going to talk about a little town scene. But I want to cover a couple basics on the scene composition component. But I had a couple things I wanted to add to previous shows we talked about that I've been playing with recently that's worth mentioning. So I've been using this florist foam. I talked about this on a previous show. We'd even done something on the build show with it. But I found this new stuff that our florist just recently turned me on to. It's a silk flower florist foam. It's a much finer granules, gives a lot smoother shape contour. Might be worth looking at if any of you guys are using the florist foam we're playing with. It's just something new I'd never heard of before. And it's like, it's like black. It's a better color to start with. You don't even have to paint the stuff. And it has a finer contour. I'm going to bring that up. So scene composition. I'll post in a comment right after the video goes live on YouTube, so you guys can go follow this. But my concept of scene composition has been refined by, and I always had this concept of this kind of in my mind. And when I started designing this layout 5 years ago, I was always thinking about how I wanted to control viewing angles. And that's the way I've described it in the past. But a couple years ago, Lance Midheim, who I think is one of the most predominant, track planning or layout designers and professional layout builders that are probably in the industry today. He's got a great blog on his website, shelflayouts.com, his commercial website, and on his lancemidheim.com site. He's got 2 blogs there where he does these kind of deep thinking, kind of provocative thoughts on how to build a layout, how to think about layout design, and how to implement some of these things. And he did something a couple years ago on scene composition, and I started using that language to describe my way of thinking as opposed to saying just viewing angles, because I think that was a simpler thing that I was doing that basically controlled where at in an aisle was the most comfortable place for you to stand, and to kind of orient the scenery around that place so that it naturally attracted a person walking along or rail fading the layout, especially to stand there for that viewing angle by putting trees in front of your view at places so you can watch the train run through trees at various times. and also positioning track work that you needed to get to uncouple or to throw turnouts right adjacent to the aisle, and pushing track work toward the back where I could. But seed composition is more than track planning, and it's more than just figuring out layouts. And while we're talking a lot about structures tonight, the bigger picture concept on seed composition is figuring out how to position structures in a way as to manipulate the viewer's eye, to manipulate what they see, how they see it, where the most comfortable angles are, and to enforce depth. Things like selective compression are part of seed composition. They're one of the tricks that we can use. And I use that too, believe in that as well. Earl Smallshaw had one of the most, probably one of the best examples of selective compression seen. And Ralph Renzetti has a video on his YouTube channel of Earl Smallshaw's layout and how he had manipulated the eyes with selective compression. But I'm going to turn the camera around 1 second, and we're going to talk about the scene that I've been designing and redesigning. So if you'll bear with me 1 moment, if there's any questions when we get to them in a second, or I can bring those up, I'm going to get the cameras turned around. So this tailed scene that you're looking at here, and I may have to continue to manipulate the camera angles as I move the camera around. You guys have seen this tail before. I've talked about this on the build show a few times. We've done various constructions that are part of this. But this was a complicated thing for me to design around. I had a hard time fitting what I wanted in the scene. I ended up having to force the viewer's eye using a lot of building flats along there. And since I've updated to 1987, a lot of things have to change here. And part of me changing is why I delayed the continuation of this construction, was me trying to figure out how I was going to adapt to the 1987 track alignment. Whereas in 1950, my track alignment was right. I designed for that. But the change to 1987 largely meant, vehicles and some details, of course, rolling stock locomotives, etc., the obvious stuff. But in a few cases, it also meant track alignment. And this is one of those cases where there's a scenic treatment and a bridge that has to go in here that I have to work with. And the adjustment to 1987 has forced me to have to rethink this enough to figure it out. But also, for the sake of talking about scene composition, I've had to design this scene and think about the scene composition twice on this one. So I've had more chance to think about that. From a perspective of structures, I build all of my structures on diorama. Well, maybe not all of them. There's a little structure setting here. All it has is a little square base setting on the scenery that forces the structure into registration, so it won't go anywhere and it'll stay in position. It also, I'm a big fan of doing that. It also forces it to be dark along the bottom edges, so you'll never see light or anything under it. All you may see is that the siding overlaps what would be the quote-unquote foundation of the structure. But I build all of my structures on diorama bases, and I'll show you another one in a moment, but that became fairly difficult figuring out this section here. Here I am controlling scene composition and controlling viewing angles by making a section about where I'm standing, which has kind of a junction right behind me, the interlocking between the two railroads. It has that as a place where you'll have to interact with the trains where you would want to, where it's an obvious place that you have to stop and wait for signals, and it comes immediately adjacent to the aisle, maybe 2 or 3 inches from the aisle, from the edge. But here I could let the track work push toward the back. But I couldn't figure out exactly how to do city structures and make them dioramas. So instead, I built this entire piece as a removable piece that controls all of this. And it butts up against the sidewalk. So the break is between the sidewalk and the structures, which is also, I thought, the easiest place for me to hide any detail or any gap with grass work. So I'm going to put some grass work along there, so when it pushes up against it, there's a little grass growing under it. That wouldn't have exactly been appropriate in 1950, but in 1987, of course, it very much would be. And I also have a rock wall over here, and I broke it in the rock wall. So the rock wall basically keystones or keys this to drop into place, and this diorama sets in place. I also broke the gap here along the road along one of the section joints of the concrete that has expansion gaps in it. I also forced this to where all the buildings basically run off the aisle, so you can look through a structure to look up at the scene. I've had to, like I said, I've had to rethink this several times, and now I'm working with it. So that structure that's there was originally pushed back, but since it's built on a diorama base that has the loading dock, etc., on it, I could pull it forward to match the new 1987 alignment. One of the joys of building structures on small diorama bases, is that it has made for taking them off if and when I move this layout, or when I inevitably move this layout in the future. It also allows me to adjust and make changes, which is the biggest reason that I have used styrofoam as my primary building medium, is that it's so doggone easy to modify it. So now I've been laying it out. Now, thinking about seed composition, I've been using some track work components where this track work alignment has to change. It was originally just taking a left. It now takes a right, goes in a different direction in 1987. So, but I am designing the flats along the backdrop, trying to figure out how to force the viewer's eye, because I do have roads that will have to meet the backdrop at 90-degree angles, and there's no good way to hide them. If you want a city that has parallel roads and you have a 2-foot depth, they're going to have to meet the backdrop at one point or another. So I've just got to hide those. I think I can hide this one fairly easy. That one is going to be a little more challenging in the 1987 alignment. So I'm still working with that. But I'd recommend, what I've done for doing a lot of this is build up a bunch of these. These are, I forget, I'll think of it in a minute who makes them, but I bought a bunch of kits, and a bunch of these DPM kits. These won't make it on the finished layout, but they gave me something to experiment with. And they basically worked as, like prototyping my layout. So I've done it one-to-one. I don't know how you would do it entirely in computer, but I do recommend that you think about this from a grand picture perspective, controlling viewing angles and manipulating it, and treating each building as a component that you can move around. And I will add, like I said, I'll post that link from Lance Midheim and his thoughts on this, so you can read those thoughts of where my concept come from. But I think that's about my time. If there's any questions about this.
Nope, there's no questions so far, Andy. So if we want to hop over and see what Robert's working on.
Awesome. I am working on an extremely tedious paper building. So this is actually I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this guy, but it's an Alistair Lee build. So these guys, off of his website, they're basically just cardstock buildings. If you really look in there, the detail is not that great when you just print it right off the printer. It's actually really kind of low quality, if that. But what I was able to do was I printed out about 10 copies of this thing. And here's where I've gotten to with this thing so far. Layered it up quite a bit. So each one of those slats, I'm trying to get the camera angle to work right so it looks good. Each one of those slats is actually layered. So I cut out 2 of the slats off the original image and just layered them up. Started from the bottom, worked my way all the way up to the top. Honestly, I don't think it looks that great, but I've gotten a few compliments off of it so far. So, to those people, I appreciate it. But everything's double layered, or triple. Some places triple layered, quadruple layered. It's all layering at this point. So, like if you look at the door here, there's actually 4 layers in the door itself. I don't even want to think about how many layers we've got up the siding here. This window here is the base, 2, 3, 4 layers as well. And that's what I'm working on right here. So I'm getting ready to fill in this open window right here on the side. So what I did, see if I can get it like one that I haven't chopped into yet. So this is how the windows come. They are flat, 2D, nothing exciting. I mean, it honestly looks kind of childish in the way it was drawn and colored in and things like that. So what I did was I took 2 extra pieces of that exact same window. I cut out the windows on this one, both the main windows. I cut out the main window here and the window in the frame on the bottom. What I'm going to do is I'm going to layer them in so that it looks like the bottom window is behind the top window, like it would be normally in your house. And I started using a glue stick, but my glue sticks were super dried out and tired, so I've gone to just using regular old cool glue, good old school glue. Use that stuff for just about everything. I've already gone ahead and put in acetate, bubble pack acetate on the back of where the windows will be, so I've got that nice little detail back in behind it. So here's where we're gonna. Tweezers are your friend. And I've got the super fine point tweezers to do this with. I've got other tweezers I've been using, but these are honestly my go-to at this point. So we're just gonna put it on, and I'm not being super delicate or super careful about, how much is going on or any of that jazz right now. Speed and time is of the essence. I don't know if I mentioned this already, and if I did, please forgive me. But I've got about 6 hours into roughly half the building, or a third of the building as it is with the roof. So now I've got that steel set. So I could totally leave it just like this, and it would look all right. Just press it in with the edge of the tweezers. Gonna have to clean off the back of the acetate. All right, there's one layer in. Now we're gonna do the other. And man, when you get, I don't know, I kind of feel like this is the cheapest way to go to get you some buildings, but there's definitely a cost versus time involved in this.
I think that's always the trade-off.
Yeah, but man, this is, I don't know if I'll do this again, dude. Seriously, like I really don't.
Well, but you could get
I've
some
got
very
6
fine
hours into
scale.
this already.
Yeah. They're looking really good, though, what you've done. And you are taking all the extra steps that I do a bit, where I step the sashes back. You don't have to people don't have to go to that much trouble for background buildings. That looks great, brother. That's a good structure.
So here's the one we just finished. So the bottom window looks stepped back. The top window looks like it's out. It almost looks like the bottom window is actually up because of how thin those frames are on it. But the top one's going to be super easy because it's basically just a giant window. So all I really have to do here is just put in the frame on the inside, and it's done. The other thing I am going to do, so I've already started to put some wood framing on the back. Let's see if that shows up. There it is. So I've already put some wood framing on the back to kind of help it be a little more rigid. So I'm thinking about going on the face of this thing, and on the other two sides, just putting some wood backing in there, make sure it sits nice and rigid and straight. With layering up the edges and the trim work, I'm actually going to come in and put one more layer of trim right here on the corner to hide this seam. Because as you layer it, what you're going to have to do is use your X-Acto knife and just kind of draw it across there slowly and lightly, and just kind of score it a couple of times before it's actually going to bend over, because you've got each one of these is its own separate layer, and some of these layers are doubled, and I haven't even counted it, but geez Louise. The other thing I am going to do is put on another layer of trim around the outside of the edge, because I do have a lip here up along the edge. So I don't really know what else to say about this other than it's a lot of tedious work, and be prepared to spend many, many, many hours on one building.
But you're in the same boat when you're doing wood structures. Like these wood structures have multi-layer sashes in them, and cutting the glass, doing all the detail for that, for the roof. You end up with a lot of time. This is a kit that costs money. Spent money and still had to do a lot of work on them. They're, high quality work, foreground work especially, likely to be time consuming. Of course, I enjoy spending the time on it, most, to a point. To a point.
So
yeah, I
William
just don't. Sorry, go ahead.
I said, William A says, for paper structures, scale makes a difference. He says he's got some for N scale, and next to other buildings with depth, it fools the eye. And the The paper building / sheds looks really good. Yeah, I got to tell you, that's a really cool model that you're doing. It looks awesome.
You know, the modeler is always harder on his work than everybody else, right? So I totally appreciate that. I really do. I've got a lot of work into it. I can see all the mistakes I've made, of course, because you know I'm the one that made them. But no, I think for my first go around, I think it looks all right.
Yeah, that trim molding, that really makes the difference with the trim molding, and I've never seen that bubble acetate for the windows. I mean, it looks killer. From the camera, it looks killer.
Yeah. So what I did was, honestly, honest to God, dude, I went and got a whole bunch of these little, basically Hot Wheels scale cars from the Dollar Tree. Um, and I was talking to Tim the other night about it and Ralph, and they're like, "Well, don't you have any bubble pack?" I'm like, "Oh, I don't think so." And then it dawned on me I did, so I went and grabbed one, and this is Dollar Tree, so it's super, super, super thin. But yeah, I think if you look at the back from the back, it looks all right.
Blister pack.
Definitely just kind of tossed in there. Yeah, blister pack.
I think it's the
Try to see if I
closest.
can.
I think it's the closest to the real glass you could get with an acetate product is that blister pack stuff. It's thick enough,
Yeah.
but it's highly reflective. Whereas the acetate that we get with a lot of structures kits, which is basically overhead projector film, it's not transparent enough for my liking, and that's why I went to use it real glass. But what you're doing there with that blister pack stuff is a very good compromise that is a doggone lot easier than real glass.
Well, and the other thing is that this stuff. These houses are gonna go. Let's see, that peninsula up to the backdrop is probably 2.5, close to 3 feet back from the wall. So these are gonna be, 2 to 2.5 inches away from the aisle. You're not really gonna see any of these mistakes or anything like that. Plus, I was talking to Ralph, and he has convinced me to use some powders and weather this thing a little bit and then seal it up with dull coat. So I think probably even those mistakes that I did make will disappear pretty quick.
Yeah, man. Yep, weathering covers the crimes, they say.
Even though it's paper, and I'm just a little nervous about going after that, dude, because I've got such a time investment in it. It's ridiculous.
Well, experiment first. I mean, that's one of the joys of this is getting to experiment. You can take a piece of paper, a piece of, blank siding or something like that, throw a little powder on it, throw a little dull coat, make sure that you're using the right quantity of dull coat and powders without doing it to your final product.
Yeah.
So, Why Are You Naked? 4 has some good comments. He says, you can scribe mullions into clear acetate and smear it in oil paint and then wipe it off the surface to create windows pretty quickly. And then he also says, Harry Clark showed this method for window building in Great Model Railroads, Indian Creek Valley. It's the Alan Keller videos.
Yep.
I'll have to go take a look at those. I don't believe I'm subscribed to him.
Well, that's a great technique for those industrial windows you see that have 16 panes or something on a fairly large window.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great technique. It might be a decent technique in what you're doing as well. I'd have to try it in your case.
So are those like the old industrial warehouse, like the green glass and like the blue glass they used to use?
Yeah, the large industrial windows. Yeah.
That'd be cool. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, and using real glass the way I like to is very hard for that case. The only solution I'd come up with for that was to etch the metal frames for that, which is kind of a job on itself. So I'll try that scratching the glass. I've heard of that before, but I've never tried it.
Well, we're coming up on Robert's time. I don't look like we have any more questions for him, so we want to hop over and see what Tim's working on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I am trying to make another telephone pole for this scene. The other night, I actually built out that real trailer, crash built it out, and now I'm trying to build another telephone pole so it actually looks like they've been 3 inches line between one pole to another. green glass beads. Pick them up at Walmart, like the craft section. What I do is I've been making a little bitty loop and a piece of wire. It'll show up or not. And then I'll get the bead. And I'll put the bead over the wire. There's some really fine wire. Right now, it's not going to block it. But hang on a minute, I may have you on, you wrong. Is that better, Johnny? All right. So what I've got here is I'm trying to wind up with something that looks like a telephone pole insulator. I can actually string my wire through the insulators that way. And I'm just drop the bead. Well, we'll go about this a different way here. Wire on the bead. And we'll feed the wire through the bead. If it'll go. The problem I have with some of these beads is some of the holes in some of them are bigger than the others. I do have a bead reamer here somewhere, but I'm not exactly sure where at the moment. This is about what I'm looking for here. Show you. Yeah, I'll transition here back over so I can show you here in a second. So I got a loop here, and I'll try to work this bead down a little bit closer to the end of the loop. Yeah, there's not much I can do for it. They're auto-focusing. That's where I liked my other camera, because I could manually focus it if I needed to. But so open the eyelet up just a little bit. Hobby knife. I'm in here with tweezers, and we'll twist. Yeah, tweezers ain't gonna be hard enough. Twist it a little bit to loop it in. And then I cut it off to a decent length. Super glue. There it is. Take some of my super glue. I squeeze just a little dab up in one of the corners of my work surface. And I can take something to scrape it and apply it. And this is going to be my cross beam. And we'll put the insulator on the cross beam. And there we got, one of our insulators. For on top of the telephone pole. And I can continue to reuse some of the pieces of wire until it gets just too small to work with. But I'm building out a couple different little scenes on my layout. One of them is one you guys have seen the last couple days. With the water tower, it's eventually going to have a pickup truck sitting up there. Where the guy's been, he's up there working in the water tower doing, whatever those guys do, checking the pressures coming out of the tower, checking the levels on the tower. And I'm building a road up to it. This is a little bit like what Robert was doing, was tedious work, because you're working with some pretty small stuff, especially when you're used to working in HO scale where things are decently sized. On your freight cars and stuff like that, except for maybe your handrails. Yeah, give me a second, Johnny, because right where I'm at here is not really indicative of being in the camera. So I'll just apply a little bit of super glue onto this. Get it on my finger so I can glue my fingers together. But that's why we have acetone hanging around, right?
Nah, acetone's for sissies.
Just pull them apart.
That's it.
That's one way to go.
Just take the finger.
I know y'all can't hear Johnny, but he said he prefers the razor saw.
Anyways, I'll go ahead and I'll put a couple more down the length of that. And I've got some round dowel that I'll glue this to be the cross beam. And I can screw one into the end, put one in the end of the pole, put the other one on top of it, and then I'll trim some brass sheet at some, scrap piece of the sheet. And I've got some metal shears here as soon as I can remember where I put them. But I don't have to use metal shears. I've got some utility scissors here also. My brass is thin enough. So I can just come down through here. Cut me off a little curly Q. Take the curly Q, straighten it out. Flatten it out. and then I can actually use this as the cross support bars. I'll cut them and lay them over top of each other, and then they'll come up and they'll meet my bar just like that. Kind of give it a support. Let me go pull the other telephone pole out so you can actually see what I've done to it. So this one here is my actual finished product.
Very nice.
So, and that is a piece of styrene rod where I capped off, just took some styrene, some flat styrene sheet, capped off the ends, and sealed it, and then sanded it down to make the transformer. So then I got eyelets so I can actually run my wire through. So what the scene's going to be is there's going to be some of the Walthers, the newer Walthers telephone poles. They're smaller than these by quite a bit. And I don't think they quite look proper to scale for the modern era. So what my electric crew is going to be doing is they're going to be going around and restringing new, heavier duty telephone poles. So, we got any questions in the chat, Ari?
No, we don't. We're about on time for that segment. Do we just want to go back to a general conversation and see what Andy and Robert accomplished in the last little bit, or?
Yeah. I also just kind of wanted to point out to everybody too. I don't know if y'all noticed or not, but Lloyd's not here. They had some sort of a medical problem. We don't know. I don't think it's Lloyd. I think it's somebody that's related to him. But y'all keep thoughts in your prayers and all that good stuff, and jujus and all that jazz. So with the rest of the time, we can just kind of open it up to general Q&A or general BS session or whatever you guys want to do, or we can shut this thing down now. It's all up to you guys.
Up to you if there's been a good conversation going on. I mean, mostly I was not covering anything specific. I was just thinking like big picture about my design, which is much what I'm doing, trying to build this bridge. I know you could probably do all this stuff truly in CAD. AutoCAD, absolutely everything. I'm sure that's possible. And I know that I'm going to be doing more of that with 3D printing and laser scanning, but man, there's a real benefit to being able to lay stuff out. I could lay it out in full size, actually experience it. So I don't know how, right now, I don't know exactly what the better way to build this bridge would be other than to kind of lay it out. So I'm doing the same thing I did for the town, basically laying this whole bridge out temporarily and then knowing exactly what size everything needs to be able to build the thing.
So I've got a question for you, Andy. Why Are You Naked asks, Andy, are you going to build some structures smaller than scale to force the perspective?
I am a little bit. So I like selective compression. I do. But I think a lot of times it is, for one thing, is that we're at kind of an inopportune scale in HO scale because the jump to N scale is so dramatic. So I am going to do a little bit of that. Like the top of this mountain that I'm working with, there's a set, well, it'll be here over top of the tunnel. There's some high tension power lines that actually strings a line across this bridge. It's there on the prototype. It needs to be here. I'm looking to do those, but even the HO scale ones are shrunk. They are already selectively compressed. They're nowhere near prototype size.
They are selectively compressed by almost 100 scale feet or so. I think that's what we came up with the other day.
Right.
I mean, they do not, they up close, off in the distance, they look great because I've got some, there's one there in the background. It's only about 8 to 10 inches maybe off the front of my layout. And it looks fine sitting there on that hill like that. But if I put it right up against my trains, my telephone pole that I'm building is taller than it.
Huh. Yeah, but especially when you start talking about trees, when you're doing scale trees, of course, I selectively compress trees. That's the biggest thing. I mean, this is Appalachia, so trees are an important thing. The trees at the foreground are, 13, 14 inches, 11 to 12 is more average with a few 14 or 15s. And as you get toward the backdrop, I mean, if you go all the way up on the top deck, they're all the way down to about 2 inches tall, 3 inches tall. But I mean, here in this area, on this section, they're about 5 or 6 inches tall at the backdrop. So I'm already doing quite a bit of selective compression with everything. And we already have selective compression. If you go buy any structure kit, it's already significantly compressed. I mean, anything you get's not going to be close to full size. Of course, I'm, scratch building a lot of it like Robert is, or significantly kit bashing so that I can get structures that are larger. And I will do, but N-scale is not the right one. So I bought some detail parts long before I got my 3D printer. Now I'll just print them. But I'd already bought some detail parts in TT scale, 1 to 1/20th. And I like some fire hydrants and stuff like that Ed Traxler had designed. They're really nice. And so I will use some TT scale parts. But one of the joys of having a 3D printer and in the future a laser cutter will be being able to do minor selective compression. Like, instead of 1 to 87, drop down to 1 to 100 or 1 to 105. Just the jump from HO to N scale is often really dramatic. And there are people who pull it off. Like I said, Earl Smallshaw pulled it off incredibly well, but he also scratch built structures through the full range of compression. It wasn't just HO scale, and then all of a sudden at a certain point it was N scale. Honestly, the N scale guys have got it made. I mean, 1 to 160 and then Z scale being 1 to 220, that's a very reasonable scale compromise. You're dropping down 33% or something. That's reasonable. When you go from 87 to 160, you're cutting it in half. That's a big jump. That's a dramatic jump.
Yeah, and that gets to be a problem when we're doing your city scenes where you're putting people in front of buildings.
Yeah.
I've noticed that a lot. The people are sized, they look all right standing off the side of a locomotive. But you start sticking them in front of some of these buildings, and they're way too big. The person standing there is taller than the door.
Well, you've got to. That's why you've got to be able to do. Well, and I've said that the 3D printer is almost justifiable from a cost perspective if all it did for me was print figures and possibly vehicles. Just those couple things, it pays for itself, and it'll print so many things. But being able to print detail parts and figures and stuff in these slightly smaller proportion scales. And I would like to see I'd love to see it done with some expanded scale where I have quite a bit of foreground scene in front of some of my areas. I've thought about using some 00 scale or 1 to 76 scale people in these buildings that I've built, and use slightly larger people to enforce the perspective, and then out on the street, a few inches in front of it, but on the other side of the glass, put HO scale. So you're seeing that 1 to 76 to the 1 to 87. Yes, it can be done. I think it too, though, just like I'm saying about laying a lot of this stuff out in 1 to 1 where you can put your eyes on it and see it and design it. Again, I'm all for doing it with computers. Heck, I'm a computer professional. I believe in doing stuff that way. But being able to design 1 to 1 where you can look at it with your eyes to figure it out, you could get some of these various scale people and just try and experiment and play with it. But I think I have to see it. Now, the people who can design movies or who do the framework and the layout work for movies, which is the closest facsimile to scene composition that I can think of. It's like a director walking in and thinking about how he's going to position cameras to get a scene. I suggest we do the same thing for our layouts, that we think about them that way.
We got 2 good comments from the chat. And Grain Express says the grain elevators are the best example of not to scale. They should tower over the hopper kernels, but they don't.
Mhm.
And then Adrian Gladson says, "Yep, you're correct. That's why I built some of my buildings, right, to give it that real world scale."
That is one reason why I scratch built my grain hoppers or my grain silo. Give me a second, I will spin the camera around, and you can see the difference in the one that I scratch built compared to, like, say, a Walther's.
Well, honestly, that's the biggest benefit in my mind to the modern way of building layouts with these thin shelf style layouts is that we can use the backdrop more effectively. So you could build silos that are 3 feet tall, 4 feet tall, if putting them against the backdrop, just as halves of silos. Same thing I'm working with the coal, this coal loadout that I'm building. It's a large structure, but I'm basically hiding most of it. I'm only building the part that's right along the right of way. Yeah.
It's actually really hard for me to get my full grain silo in because of how big it is.
Of course, but how much more believable the fact that you can, and we still have to do some compression, but it's much more believable if you can compress it a lot less than what the manufacturers try to convince us we should do.
I mean, if I was going to have one off in a, like on a 4x8 layout and have it sitting up on a hill or in the way in the back, 2-3 feet off, yeah, maybe if I'm not going to actually have train cars sitting next to it. But since mine's only a foot off the edge of my layout, and I'm going to have train cars sitting there almost all the time, I figure I needed something a lot bigger than what the actual scale ones are on that are available out there.
But it needs to be almost, my opinion is that these large industrial situations need to be almost overwhelming. I even feel that way about trees, why the trees need to be so large. But like the coal loadout I need to build needs to be something like 2.5 feet tall. It needs to be overwhelming. They're large, large structures.
Yes, and I'm almost in total agreement with you guys that a lot of these buildings are too scaled down.
Well, I mean, they can't even justify the service that we give them. I mean, how many structures out there? And there's plenty of good manufacturers that do a good job, but how many structures are there out there that couldn't justify a boxcar load of equipment? And they're the size of a boxcar. How would you load the boxcar? There's not enough stuff in that building to fill up a boxcar.
Adrian Gadsden says also cement works are massive operations compared to cement companies, the same as grain and etc. Just huge facilities.
Well, I love aggregate. Aggregate's a great facility that I rarely see modeled effectively, and it's because these companies make these kits. And you can take a Walther's, and I understand why Walther's, all these companies make these kits, but you can take one of these Walther's kits, you'd need 3 or 4 of them, and combine them, you could get something quite large and get the details.
Well, the Walther's cement facility is actually fairly large. I mean, granted, it's not as big as what it should be, but out of all the Walther's kits, it's probably one of the biggest ones that they offer.
Huh.
And it is not cheap by no means. I think I paid $80 for it.
Oh, I think I was thinking of like Glacier Gravel or something, which is super small. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Glacier Gravel would be just your little local podunk, like what Mulzer Crushed Stone is.
Well, I'll tell you what, they are getting better. The trend in our hobby, I think has been driven a lot by like the RPM meets and the groups of people who frequent those things. That's why so much of the rolling stock that's out there is prototype and road number and era specific detail parts, of course. But the same thing is true when it comes to scale and compression. I mean, look at like the steelworks structures. That is a large peninsula on a layout. That'll fill a large peninsula. And that was so popular, they've sold it out several times and had to re-go into manufacturing to bring that kit back. So people, we're obviously wanting to recreate this industrial, the industrial era to some reasonable, if not overwhelming scale.
Well, and like you said, there's a lot of people out there that do want, we're building more shelf layouts. So buildings are sitting more on the edges of our layouts than what they used to. And they're sitting closer to the trains.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have evolved away from the big 4x8, one peninsulas around the wall, the mushroom design, and you just don't have the space to model. For the center of your plywood sheet to be a plant or a power plant or a big grain operation.
I mean, the Walters power plant, it's big structure. Don't get me wrong, but my biggest issue with the power plant on the Walters side of it is it only comes with one stack. How many power plants have you seen with just one stack? Around here, usually there's 3, 4, 5, stacks because they've got more than one boiler and they're exhausting out of more than one spot. So then you got to order more, and then they don't really sell the stacks for that power plant by itself.
Oh yeah, what you would need to model a true power plant. The power plants that I'm familiar with, the big old coal burners that I used to tear down. That facility was like 1.5 miles long. The rail yard they had to service it. They had 4 or 5 burners. They had these chemical reduction plants. The switch yards are massive. Yeah, it would all be really cool to model, but you got to pick and choose and compress on your own too.
Well, not to mention you got cooling. You got the cooling towers, the cooling pond.
Oh yeah, all the ash pits and all that stuff. We can't hear Andy if he's talking to us. He might be muted. Why are you naked? Says a good statement. He says, you would think that the high-end kit manufacturers that are $300 plus kits that are limited production anyways could do a scale side industry because, and he's right. You're dealing with high-end modelers that are looking for all those pieces. The 4 or 5 above ground storage tanks, the multiple buildings, the 3 or 4 stories.
But they need to sell them basically as flats. They need to sell these kits. Do something that I love that Nick Basti does with Imagine That Laser is he sells the structure in a way that you can use it 4 or 5 different ways by default. Of course, you can always cut it up. That's kit bashing. But the kit is designed from scratch to be kit bashable and to be folded out into a flat. And if they all did that, and like I said, that's what I would do if I used the Walters power plant is I would fold it out to make a flat. I'd make it 4 or 5 inches thick. I like low. I don't care much about building flats very often, but I like low relief buildings that are only a few inches thick. I like a little depth to them, a little bit. But you can build it a little bit, and then you can just take and make a mold of that of those towers and cast a few more. Yes, that's a pain, and it's not for everybody. And it's a shame we have to do it.
And see, that's another reason why I want a 3D printer is so I can take that real trailer that I just built, scratch built this last week, and input the shape and everything in it, and then print it off. That's the other plus to a 3D printer is you can print, some of your stuff scale size. Now, granted, some of it you're not going to be able to because your printer's not, not got a big enough print bed.
No, but you can print it in multiple pieces. But it's all about the right medium for the right job. If you're trying to build building walls, you're probably better to do that just taking a piece of scribed brick, either plastruct or just buy the brickwork that's available, laser cut brickwork that's available in sheets from several of the people. Several of the laser manufacturers out there making just sheets of brick. Actually, you can get that in plaster from Downtown Deco. They sell big sheets, basically, size of a piece of paper. You can buy a few sheets of that, cut you out some windows, etc. Have a great looking low relief background structure and 3D detail parts.
All right. So there is my main crossbar with the insulators on it.
Get in. That looks nice. Well, the color is so hard. I tried forever trying to get the old insulators. Now that I've moved to 87, the power line situation is so much easier for me. Yeah, I've got some of those. I like them, actually. They look pretty nice.
The biggest
issue, they need to be.
They're not all the same size, so you got to go through and sort them out.
Oh, okay. Well, we were talking about selective compression largely in talking about decreasing the size of things, but I'm not sure, or it's my instinct, and I'm no expert. I'm just a dumb monkey like anybody else. Where's my opinion on this matter? But my instinct is that even as particular and precise as the persnickety as I like to be about a lot of this stuff, I'm not sure that doing everything perfectly to scale is the right answer, because it's all about what the human eye perceives. And there are times when, like those insulators, they should be larger, in my opinion. You wouldn't see them if they're scale. I've got them scale in 3D printed parts from Shapeways. It's pointless. There's no point. By the time you wrap a wire around it, it's not there. There are things that need to be slightly oversized, and there are things that probably should be slightly shrunk. Like trees probably should be slightly smaller. Probably.
And I think that also depends on the area that you're modeling.
Oh, yes.
How big, you're modeling Appalachia. Some of those trees out there are huge because they've been standing for hundreds of years.
Yep.
Some of them are fairly small because they come and clear cut a lot of those mountains too.
Strobe Light Audio says, can you make them appear larger with forced perspective?
Well, that's a reason that I like. So one thing that I've decided that I like, I started out building I wanted trees that were truly scaled. And I've got quite a few that are 15 inches tall. I'm now using those in places. I've moved them. And I'm now using them in places where the track work is pushed back toward the back pretty far. And I'm using them there at the foreground. I found that was more convincing. They are basically, yes, they are true to scale. They are true 120, 130-foot trees. And those totally exist in Appalachia. But because of the proportionality of everything else, I'm basically using those as if they were larger than scale in the foreground. As the track work is closer to the edge of the aisle, I'm only using, 10 or 11 inch trees. It's a minor difference, but there's effects. And subtlety is probably key. When it comes to manipulating proportions, it probably should be a somewhat subtle effect because you don't want it to be glaring. If it's obvious to you that structure is in scale, this one is HO scale, the illusion starts to fall down. Your mind can figure it out on its own. All right. If nobody else, if we don't have anything else, if there's no more questions in the chat, I think that'll be this show. We'll be back in 2 weeks again for episode 9. Of course, as we said before, send us any questions or comments that you have. Comment after this. I will post here shortly the comment in one of the top comments about with a link to that Lance Midheim blog. It's a page of reading, and I could not recommend it more to go read that little bit. And his blog's got all kinds of great stuff, but that one article is particularly interesting on this subject. But you can email us, of course, any one of us individually, just our first name at modelraritylive.com, or you can email questions to the show. So we'll add them to next month's show at empires@modelraritylive.com. Of course, you can check out, follow us on our Facebook page and comment there, Model Rarity Live page, as well as our website, www.modelraritylive.com. You'll find some information there on the website and a calendar for upcoming shows. All our upcoming shows should be posted on that calendar, so you can follow along and see what's coming up next. We'll see you guys next week on Johnny's show as well. And that'll be us for the evening. Guys.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Yep. Have a good night, everybody.